Night descends on the Topkapi Palace like a curtain of ink, and with it comes a silence so heavy it presses against the chest. The city, beyond the walls, bazaars still flickering with oil lamps, fishermen pulling in the last nets, breathes freely. But inside these walls, breath is measured. Even the air feels owned. The palace glitters under the moon, domes and minarets, gleaming like the scales of some vast, coiled beast. From a distance, it seems divine. Up close, it is a fortress of velvet and iron, where gold leaf hides the cold geometry of cages. A single corridor stretches into shadow. Its marble tiles have been polished so fiercely they hold the torchlight like liquid, bending it around the silent figures who stand guard. Two men, eunuchs, in black silk robes, do not move except for the occasional flicker of their eyes toward a carved cedar door at the far end. That door is painted with curling vines and flowers, an artist's labor meant to distract from the truth. It is a door to a world few enter willingly, and fewer leave. From the darkness behind it comes the faintest sound, a fabric rustle, a muffled sob, then nothing. The sob is gone so quickly one might think it imagined, like a trick of the light, but the guards do not glance at each other. They have heard it before, many times. Somewhere deeper in the palace, keys clink softly against a belt as another eunuch passes through a courtyard of sleeping fountains. He moves like smoke, gliding between latticed windows where the shapes of women can sometimes be seen for a heartbeat, an arm adjusting a veil, a face catching moonlight, a silhouette turning away before the eye can settle. The harem, to those outside, is a word whispered with envy or lust, but inside, it is a place where desire is forged into a weapon. Every inch is measured, the heat of the baths, the brightness of the lamps, the scent of the oils rubbed into skin not for comfort but for display. Even silence has a function here. In the corner of a corridor, a bracelet lies on the floor, broken, its pearls scattering toward a crack in the marble. One pearl has been crushed, its sheen dulled. The camera would linger on it, close up, before tilting upward to reveal a narrow door ajar, just enough for a sliver of light to leak out. Inside, a girl no older than 15 kneels on a rug, her hands shaking as another woman applies kohl to her eyelids. The older woman's face is a mask of calm, but her grip is steel. The girl's eyes are wide, fixed on a gilded mirror. She does not see herself, only the outline of the man she will meet tonight, the man who decides whether she rises to power or disappears. Above them, in a locked chamber known as the cage, a young prince walks slow circles across the carpet. He is not yet 20, but has the eyes of a man who has counted too many days. The room is large, but he never strays far from its center. Every footstep is careful, as if he fears the walls themselves are listening. Perhaps they are. Here, future sultans grow into shadows, raised in isolation so that no one might use them as a pawn, until the day they are needed or eliminated. The empire beyond the palace thrives on trade, war, and diplomacy, but the empire within these walls thrives on ritualized control of the body, of the mind, of the will. The harem is not simply a collection of women. It is an instrument of governance. Through its inner politics, sultans secure loyalty, silence opposition, and shape the next generation. The women inside are not merely companions. They are currency, hostages, and weapons all at once. A scribe, seated at a low desk, dips his pen into ink as he copies a royal edict. The words are about land disputes in a far province, yet his hand trembles slightly. He hears the faint melody of a ney flute drifting from the women's quarters. The tune is beautiful, but it chills him. He knows it is a signal, though not meant for him. He keeps writing, eyes fixed on the parchment, because in this palace, the worst thing one can do is notice too much. Outside, the Bosphorus glimmers under the moon, carrying ships toward distant lands. Inside, the current runs a different way. It flows toward the cedar door, through the baths, past the mirrors, into the chambers where selections are made. It flows toward the heart of the harem, where beauty is weighed like gold and the slightest imperfection can tip the scales. A eunuch reaches the painted door and knocks twice. Slow, deliberate, the hinges creak as it opens, revealing a corridor lit by a line of small oil lamps. The light flickers on tiled walls painted with gardens and nightingales, illusions of freedom for those who will never see the real thing again. The eunuch steps aside and a girl walks through, her feet bare, her anklets whispering with each step. She is flanked by two other women, older, dressed in fine silk, eyes sharp as blades. They guide her forward, and the door closes behind them with a sound like a page turning in a book you cannot unread. In the world beyond, merchants haggle, lovers quarrel, and fishermen haul in their catch. In here, every choice, every breath, every glance is scripted by those who pull invisible strings. And tonight, somewhere between the painted gardens and the real iron bars, another life will be rewritten. The terror of the Ottoman palace is not always in what is done, but in how it is done. Layered in ceremony, softened by beauty, hidden in plain sight, the Ottoman Empire at its height was a world stitched together by conquest, commerce, and a ruthless understanding of human nature. It stretched from the burning sands of Arabia to the green hills of the Balkans, from the trade ports of North Africa to the walls of Vienna. To hold such a vast realm together required armies, laws, and diplomacy. But above all, it required control. And nowhere was control more perfected, more refined, than within the walls of the Sultan's own palace. Topkapi was not simply a residence. It was a city inside a city, a self-contained organism that beat to its own rhythm. Its courtyards, chambers, and gardens were arranged like layers of an onion, each one more restricted, more secretive than the last. The outer courtyards bustled with pages, janissaries, and servants, attending to the daily business of the empire. But as you passed through each guarded gate, the air changed. Quieter, heavier, as if the stones themselves knew you were moving toward the empire's beating heart. That heart was not the Sultan's throne room, nor the council chamber where viziers debated the fate of provinces. It was the harem, a word that to the outside world carried a haze of exoticism, of silk and perfume, of beautiful women lounging in luxury. But the reality was far more intricate, far more dangerous. The harem was a political engine, a crucible where alliances were forged, where rivalries sharpened into weapons, where the next ruler of the empire could be made or unmade long before he ever wore the crown. The Sultan was the empire, and the empire was the Sultan. But even he could not rule alone. Behind him stood the Valid Sultan, his mother, whose influence could rival any grand vizier's. She was the guardian of the harem, the keeper of its secrets, the ultimate arbiter of which woman gained the Sultan's attention, and which was quietly sent away. Beneath her were layers of hierarchy, the Baskadin, or first consort, followed by other favored women, then the odalisks, those still unchosen, each waiting for the moment that might change her fate. This hierarchy was enforced not only by custom, but by an invisible network of surveillance. The black eunuchs, castrated in brutal rituals far from Istanbul, were the harem's gatekeepers. Their loyalty was absolute, for they had no families, no ambitions beyond the palace walls. They carried messages, escorted women, and most importantly, ensured that no man save the Sultan ever crossed the threshold. Their eyes missed nothing, their ears gathered every whisper. Yet the harem was not a prison in the obvious sense. Its rooms were lined with Iznik tiles, each a burst of cobalt and coral in floral patterns that seemed to bloom even in winter. Fountains murmured in courtyards scented with jasmine, and the women's quarters were stocked with silks, jewels, and books. But these luxuries were as much a tool of control as the locks on the doors. A life surrounded by beauty could still be suffocating when every choice, every movement was dictated by another's will. The women of the harem came from across the empire and beyond. Some were tribute from conquered lands, gifted by governors eager to curry favor. Others were bought from distant slave markets. Circassian girls prized for their pale skin, Greek and Albanian girls for their eyes and hair, African women for their grace and strength. A rare few entered by choice, lured by dreams of wealth and influence. But once inside, choice ceased to exist. Before a girl even glimpsed the Sultan, she underwent a transformation. She was taught the Ottoman language, schooled in court etiquette, trained in music, dance, and the art of conversation. Her every gesture was refined, her posture corrected, her voice softened. She learned to bow at the right angle, to smile without showing too many teeth, to speak only when spoken to. This was not education, it was conditioning. By the time she stood before the Sultan, she would not merely please him, she would seem designed for him. But beauty alone was not enough. The harem was a battlefield where weapons were words, glances, and alliances. A single misplaced comment could ruin a woman, while a well-timed favor to the right servant could elevate her overnight. Friendships were rare, trust rarer still. The same woman who braided your hair in the morning might whisper poison into the Valid sultan's ear by nightfall. For the sultan, the harem was both pleasure and politics. Every woman represented not just companionship, but a potential alliance. Marrying or favoring a woman from a particular region could secure loyalty from that province, or provoke rebellion. The birth of a son was a triumph, but also a danger, for each prince had his own supporters, his own faction within the palace. When the time came for succession, those factions would clash like armies, and the losers would pay in blood. And so, the harem existed in a constant state of quiet war. The women smiled, danced, sang, but every performance was a maneuver, every compliment a calculation. Even the sultan's gaze could be a weapon, bestowing power on one woman while condemning another. Outside the palace, the people of Istanbul gossiped about the harem as if it were a fairy tale. They imagined the sultan wandering among perfumed gardens, attended by dozens of adoring beauties. They never saw the tears shed in the baths, the cold rivalries in the corridors, the way the walls seemed to lean in at night. The truth was that the harem was not built for the happiness of its women. It was built to ensure the stability of the throne. And stability came at a cost measured in human lives, in freedom stolen, in love crushed beneath the weight of duty. As the empire expanded, so too did the harem's reach. New faces arrived from distant lands, each carrying the hopes of her family or the grief of her capture. Some would rise to unimaginable power, ruling the empire in all but name. Others would vanish into obscurity, their names erased, their stories swallowed by the palace walls. And beyond all this lay the unspoken truth. The harem was not merely a place of pleasure. It was a place where the boundaries between consent and coercion, loyalty and survival, blurred into a single suffocating reality. It is within this world, lavish yet lethal, that our story will move. Through marble corridors and behind locked doors, we will see how beauty became a currency, how love was both weapon and weakness, and how the empire's most guarded secrets were not written in ink, but in the lives of those who lived and died in the shadow of the sultan. The path into the harem did not begin at the palace gates. For most, it began far away, in a mountain village, a bustling port, or a market square where strangers spoke languages they didn't understand. Sometimes the journey started with an invitation, other times with a raid, but it always ended in the same place, before the painted cedar door of the women's quarters. In the far reaches of the empire, whispers of the harem's splendor traveled like smoke, always alluring, never entirely true. Mothers told their daughters that a place in the palace could mean a life of luxury, protection, and influence. They left out what it meant to surrender your freedom to a world where your value was measured in how well you could please a man you might never meet. For others, there was no choice at all. The désormais, a system originally meant for recruiting boys into the elite Janissary Corps, had its shadow twin. From certain provinces, tribute was demanded not in coin, but in flesh. Officials would arrive with soldiers and lists of names, selecting the most beautiful girls as if choosing horses from a stable. A weeping father was no more protection than a locked door. The empire's reach was absolute. Once taken, the journey to Istanbul was its own transformation. The girls were stripped of their clothing and dressed in simple garments, a blank canvas for what was to come. Their hair was washed with rose water, their nails trimmed, their ears pierced if they weren't already. They were taught to walk with small, measured steps, no running, no slouching, no turning without grace. The first lesson was simple: the body is not your own anymore. Arrival at the palace was overwhelming. The gates loomed high, carved with verses from the Quran, guarded by soldiers whose eyes gave nothing away. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of musk, incense, and the sea. From the first moment, the girls were separated from their old lives. Their names were often changed to something more pleasing in Ottoman Turkish, sometimes to erase foreign origins, other times to mold them into the court's aesthetic. They were not immediately presented to the sultan. That honor, or danger, was reserved for later. First came training. Under the watchful eye of the usta, senior women who had long mastered the palace's unspoken codes, the newcomers learned the art of survival. Every detail was drilled into them: how to bow without seeming servile, how to smile without inviting insult, how to recite poetry at a dinner without overshadowing another woman. They learned which colors flattered their complexion, which scents complemented their skin, which fabrics whispered rather than rustled when they moved. Their hair was braided into elaborate patterns, each style signaling a different stage of their training. Discipline was constant. A misstep, a laugh too loud, a glance held too long could result in a punishment that was swift and silent. It might be a demotion to kitchen duty, scrubbing pots until your hands blistered. It might be the confiscation of your jewelry, a public stripping of the status you had barely begun to earn. The lessons went beyond manners. They were schooled in history, religion, and the politics of the empire, not to empower them, but to ensure they could converse intelligently when called upon. A woman who could discuss poetry or recite the lineage of sultans was more valuable than one who could only sing or dance. But knowledge was dangerous too. A woman too clever might be seen as a threat. The balance was delicate. Enough intelligence to intrigue, not enough to alarm. Then there were the inspections. The Sultan himself did not attend these, but his trusted women and black eunuchs did. The girls would stand in a tiled chamber lit by dozens of oil lamps, the air warm with steam from the baths. One by one they were examined, not in a crude display, but in a clinical appraisal that felt colder for its politeness. Skin was checked for blemishes, teeth for perfection, hair for thickness and shine. A small scar could end your chances before you ever began. Those who passed would be assigned to different ranks. The most promising were placed in the Gedikli, the elite group closest to the Sultan. Others were sent to serve higher-ranking women, running errands, arranging clothing, fetching perfumes. It was menial work, but it was also the best place to watch and learn. Every gesture of the Valid Sultan, every glance between rivals, was a lesson in power. For the unlucky, there was another fate. Quiet removal from the palace, their names never recorded. Where they went, no one said. Some whispered of distant farms, others of being sold back into markets far from the capital. The palace never admitted to discards. It simply erased them. One girl, let's call her Layla, arrived from a village near the Black Sea, her eyes the pale green of winter moss. She had been told she was being sent to serve in the home of a noblewoman. Only when she saw the domes of Topkapi on the horizon did she understand where she was going. She resisted the training at first, refusing to lower her gaze or let the ustas paint her lips with crushed pomegranate. But the palace has a way of bending even the most stubborn spirit. Within months, Layla's defiance had become calculation. She learned which eunuchs could be bribed for information, which women could be flattered into alliance. She would not be chosen for beauty alone. She would be chosen because she knew how to be indispensable. For every Layla, there were dozens more who vanished into the machinery of the harem, their individuality swallowed by the system. The palace was not interested in who you had been before. It cared only for what you could be made into. And so the price of entry was never just youth or beauty or even freedom. It was identity itself. To cross the threshold into the harem was to agree, willingly or not, that you would be remade in the image the palace required. And once remade, there was no going back. From the outside, the harem was a paradise of silks, jewels, and music. From the inside, it was a crucible, where girls were stripped to their essence and rebuilt into something both exquisite and terrifying. If the price of entry stripped away a woman's identity, life inside the harem rebuilt it into something far more dangerous. This was not a static prison. It was a living organism, pulsing with ambition, secrets, and rivalries sharper than any blade. Every day here was a contest, every night a test. The harem was arranged like a labyrinth, its corridors twisting through courtyards, galleries, and baths. The walls glittered with tiles so intricate you could lose yourself in their patterns. Each flower and vine a fragment of a story, centuries old. But beneath this beauty lay tension so thick it seemed to hum in the air. Even the fountains, trickling with endless water, sounded like whispers. To survive here, you had to learn quickly that nothing was as it seemed. A warm smile could hide a dagger. A casual compliment could be bait for a trap. The women did not openly quarrel, at least not in front of the eunuchs, or the valid sultan, but the rivalries played out in subtle, deadlier ways. A missing piece of jewelry before a royal audience. A gown accidentally stained just before the sultan's evening promenade. A rumor whispered into the right ear, timed so perfectly it bloomed into scandal before the accused could defend herself. The Valide Sultan presided over all, like the moon over a restless sea. She moved rarely, spoke little, yet every shift in her expression rippled through the ranks. One raised eyebrow could elevate a girl to prominence. One prolonged silence could mark her for ruin. Those who understood her moods thrived. Those who didn't learned quickly or disappeared. The daily rhythm of the harem was both monotonous and perilous. At dawn, the women gathered for morning prayers, their voices echoing softly in the tiled prayer hall. Afterward came lessons, calligraphy, poetry, music. The younger women practiced dance, their bodies moving in graceful arcs as tutors barked corrections. Older, more favored women spent the mornings in conversation, weaving alliances like silken threads. By midday, the baths filled with steam and chatter. Here, the rivalries sharpened. The baths were the harem's courtrooms, where verdicts were whispered between rinsed hair and oiled skin. A woman's standing could rise or fall based on the company she kept in these moments. Sit beside someone in favor, and you might be noticed. Linger near a woman out of grace, and her misfortune could stain you like ink. And then there were the evenings, when the Sultan might call for companionship. No one knew in advance who would be chosen. The uncertainty was part of the game. Some women spent hours preparing, oiling their hair, perfuming their skin, dressing in silks that shimmered in candlelight. Others, secure in their position, waited with a calculated calm, knowing that seeming too eager could be fatal. When the black eunuchs arrived with a summons, silence fell like a dropped curtain. The chosen woman would rise, every movement deliberate, her face composed no matter what storms raged beneath it. She would be escorted through corridors lit only by lamps, her footsteps muffled by thick carpets. Behind her, the other women would exchange glances, envy, relief, or barely concealed triumph at not being chosen. The Sultan's favor was the most intoxicating drug in the palace, but it was also the most volatile. One night in his company could change a woman's life, granting her gifts, servants, and influence beyond her rank, but it could also make her a target. A single misstep, a poorly timed remark, a trace of boredom in her eyes could see her cast aside before the next moon rose. The most dangerous women in the harem were not always the most beautiful. They were the ones who understood that this was not about seduction alone. It was about survival through strategy. Some became masters of subtle manipulation, planting suggestions in the Sultan's mind that seemed to bloom from his own thoughts. Others formed alliances with powerful eunuchs, securing early warnings of changes in palace politics. One such woman, known only in the records as Herm, had entered the harem as a slave from Ruthenia. She was not the most beautiful, but she was the most astute. Within a year, she had risen from odalisque to the Sultan's most trusted confidant. She maneuvered herself into a position where even the Valide Sultan could not touch her, an unprecedented feat. Her enemies tried to ensnare her in scandal, but each attempt seemed to strengthen her hold. She understood the unspoken law of the harem. Power is not taken in a single strike. It is accumulated like water, drop by drop, until the flood cannot be stopped. But for every harem, there were a dozen others who overplayed their hand. One woman, gifted with extraordinary beauty, allowed herself to become careless. She mocked another concubine in front of the wrong servant. The insult traveled up the chain until it reached the Valide Sultan, who smiled politely and said nothing. Days later, the mocking woman was gone, sent, they said, to a coastal estate. Whether she saw the sea again was a matter of speculation, whispered in the baths. The harem's intrigues were not limited to the women alone. Black eunuchs, though sworn to loyalty, held immense power as the sole link between the harem and the outside world. They could carry messages, arrange private meetings, or bury a scandal before it reached dangerous ears. A eunuch's favor could be the difference between life in silk and life in exile, but their loyalty came at a price, often paid in secrets more valuable than gold. Every day was a balance between visibility and discretion. Be seen too much, and you risked making enemies. Be invisible, and you risked being forgotten. The art of survival in the harem was to be exactly as noticeable as necessary. No more, no less. Yet beneath all the plotting and performance, there was a constant undercurrent of fear. The harem was a place where fortunes could reverse overnight, where a favored woman could be cast aside without explanation, where alliances could turn to betrayals before the ink on a promise had dried. In the palace's long memory, there were countless stories of women who had stood at the height of favor one day and vanished the next. This was the true engine of the harem, not beauty, not desire, but the relentless churn of ambition and survival. The palace could dress it in silk and call it paradise, but everyone inside knew it was a storm that never ceased. And in such a storm, you either learn to navigate the winds or you drown. In the harem, beauty was a currency, but like all currency, it could lose its value. And when it did, the palace did not keep useless coin. The women who entered, believing they had secured a life of luxury, learned quickly. The same door that brought you in could be the one that led you out, though not always in the way you imagined. The discarded did not vanish in a single dramatic moment. Their disappearance began quietly, almost imperceptibly. First, the summons to the Sultan became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Servants who once greeted them warmly now averted their eyes. Gossip at the baths turned silent when they approached. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn around them, marking them as untouchable. Some were removed gently, sent away with gifts to marry officials in distant provinces. To the outside world, these women were rewarded for their service, but they knew the truth. This was exile in silk. Others were not given such courtesy. When a woman fell out of favor for reasons too dangerous to speak aloud, perhaps she knew too much. Perhaps she had angered the Valid Sultan. Her departure was sudden and final. She might be told she was moving to another part of the palace. She might be summoned for an assignment outside the walls. And then she was gone. The corridor she once walked daily would be given to someone else. Her possessions quietly divided among rivals. Within days, it was as if she had never existed. There were whispers about what happened to these women. Some claimed they were placed in remote estates along the Bosphorus, watched by loyal guards until the end of their days. Others said they were married off to men who could be trusted never to let them speak of palace life. And there were darker rumors still, of silent midnight processions through the palace gardens, of weighted sacks lowered into the dark waters of the Golden Horn. The most chilling part was the way the harem itself seemed to conspire in forgetting them. The women left behind rarely spoke of the discarded. It wasn't just fear, it was self-preservation. To dwell on another's downfall was to risk drawing attention to your own. Survival demanded selective memory. One story, whispered in the tiled halls long after the fact, told of a woman named Ice. She had once been a favorite of the Sultan, gifted with emerald earrings and a place beside him at feasts. But her ambition burned too brightly. She began aligning herself with a particular faction in the palace, whispering political suggestions into the Sultan's ear. It was a dangerous gamble, one the Valid Sultan did not forgive. One winter night, the oil lamps in Aza's chamber burned low. She was summoned by two black eunuchs she had never seen before. They told her she was being moved to more private quarters. She followed, her emerald earrings glinting faintly in the lamplight. The next morning, her bed was empty, her jewelry gone, her name never spoken again. The harem adapted swiftly. Her rivals moved into her rooms. Her gowns were altered to fit other bodies, and the emerald earrings appeared months later on the ears of a different favorite. No one asked where she had gone. The palace had no appetite for ghosts. The fear of becoming one of the forgotten kept the women in constant motion. Every smile, every gift, every gesture was calculated to reinforce their worth. It wasn't enough to have the Sultan's affection. You had to be useful to the entire machinery of the palace. A woman who could no longer charm, entertain, or influence was a liability, and liabilities were erased. Even the black eunuchs, powerful as they were, lived under this shadow. Their status depended entirely on the trust of the Valid Sultan and the Sultan himself. One wrong word, one failed duty could see them replaced and vanished just as efficiently as any woman. In the palace, no one was untouchable. And so, the fate of the discarded hung over the harem like an unspoken law. It shaped every conversation, every alliance, every betrayal. It was why women smiled at rivals they despised, why they offered small kindnesses to those beneath them, because one day they might need those same hands to pull them back from the edge. The discarded were not mourned. They were not remembered. They were simply gone. And the palace went on, its corridors echoing with footsteps that never paused to look back. Because in Top Copy, survival was not about being loved. It was about never giving the palace a reason to let you go. In the golden histories of the Ottoman Empire, the harem is often painted as a place of beauty, a shimmering world of silks, fountains, and moonlit gardens. But the truth is heavier. It is not told in the bright colors of tile work or the glitter of jewels. It is written in the lives that pass silently through its corridors, in the women whose names never escaped its gates. Every tile on those walls, every polished marble step, had been walked by countless feet, feet that once ran freely through villages, along riverbanks, in childhood homes far from here. Those steps slowed in the palace. They became measured, deliberate, careful, and over time, they became indistinguishable from one another. The harem did not simply take women's freedom. It took their pasts. Whatever life they had lived before crossing that cedar door became irrelevant. The palace did not care if you had once been a farmer's daughter or the child of a noble house. Here, you were only what you could be made into. And that remaking came at the cost of the self. Imagine the quiet moments no history book records. The girl who sits by a window staring at the Bosphorus she will never sail. The woman who holds her breath every time footsteps approach, unsure if they bring summons or banishment. The rivalries were fierce, yes, but beneath them lay something darker, a shared knowledge that none of them truly owned their fate. The palace had a way of erasing even the idea of escape. Some learned to survive by burying their longing, convincing themselves that the world outside had forgotten them. Others clung to scraps of their old lives, a lullaby whispered under their breath, a hidden charm sewn into the lining of a gown. Those tiny rebellions were their only proof they had existed before this place. And yet, even here, where power moved like a shadow and love was just another currency, there were flickers of humanity, a stolen moment of laughter between women who were supposed to be rivals, a eunuch quietly passing news from a far-off homeland, the warmth of a shared meal on a cold night, when the world beyond the walls seemed impossibly far away. These moments did not undo the cruelty of the system, but they were acts of resistance all the same. They were a reminder that even in the tightest cage, the human spirit will look for cracks where light can enter. Still, the truth was inescapable. The harem was not built to cherish the women within it. It was built to control them. Their beauty served the sultan. Their alliances served the palace. Their children, if they bore them, served the dynasty, and when they could no longer serve, they became invisible. The fear of that invisibility shaped every choice. It made kindness dangerous, trust costly, and hope a thing to be rationed. And yet, hope never died completely, because hope is stubborn. It survives even in the darkest rooms. When you strip away the silks, the jewels, the carefully staged performances, what remains is something raw, a human need to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. That was the one thing the harem could never fully erase. Even when the palace pretended they did not exist, these women carried their stories in the quiet corners of their hearts. And maybe, just maybe, that is the real legacy of the harem, not the political alliances, not the scandals or the rivalries, but the untold stories of the women who lived there, stories that survived in whispers, in fragments, in the memories of servants and scribes who dared to remember. Because history often belongs to the powerful, but memory? Memory belongs to anyone brave enough to keep it alive. The harem's story is not merely one of silk and scandal, nor simply of power and politics. It is the story of a palace that could smile while swallowing whole the people who lived within it. And though the Ottoman Empire itself has long since fallen, the harem's shadow has not vanished. It lingers, woven into the air of Topkapi Palace, into the echo of every step taken across its marble floors. From the outside, the palace still gleams. The domes catch the sun as they once did in the days of sultans, and the golden finials shine as though they have never known dust. Seagulls circle above the Bosphorus, just as they have for centuries, their cries folding into the sound of the waves below. Tourists gather in clusters at the gates, cameras ready, unaware of how many lives pass through those same gates without ever coming back. Inside, the light changes. The courtyard stones are worn smooth by the weight of centuries of feet. Janissaries in tall plumed helmets, eunuchs moving in silence, women whose eyes scanned every shadow for a sign of their fate. The gardens are still beautiful, still meticulously kept, but beauty here has always been more than it appears. These were the gardens where alliances were sealed with a glance, where a walk among the roses might be the last a woman ever took in the open air. The tiled corridors shine, every surface polished to perfection. Blue isnik blossoms climb the walls, frozen mid-bloom, each petal traced with the hand of an artisan who likely never knew the true purpose of the rooms his work would adorn. Stand long enough before those tiles and you might notice the way their flowers lean toward the doors, as if even in paint they long to escape. The baths still hold their domes aloft, pierced with tiny glass windows that scatter the sunlight into shards. The steam no longer rises, but the echo remains, the sound of water poured into basins, the hush of voices plotting in corners, the muffled sobs swallowed by the hiss of heated stone. The air feels thicker here, as though it remembers every secret ever spoken in its warmth. In the hall of the Valleyed Sultan, the ceilings soar with gold leaf patterns that catch the light like flames. This was where she received emissaries, heard petitions, made decisions that could elevate a woman to glory or send her into oblivion. Stand here today, and the grandeur is almost overwhelming. Until you imagine the silence after she pronounced her verdict, and the footsteps of the condemned fading into the distance. The kafesh, the cage, still stands, its latticed windows looking out onto courtyards where no prince was ever allowed to set foot freely. The carpets inside are bright and well kept, but they cannot soften the knowledge of what this place was. A velvet prison for the empire's heirs. Here, the air is too still, too perfect, as if it has not moved in centuries. Some say if you press your ear to the lattice, you can still hear the pacing steps of princes who counted the days until they forgot the number. And then there are the quieter corners, the narrow staircases that twist unexpectedly, the small courtyards tucked between walls, the doorways that lead to rooms no guidebook mentions. These were the places where the invisible life of the harem unfolded, where servants exchanged glances heavy with meaning, where women paused to catch their breath away from the gaze of their rivals, where a eunuch waited in shadow to deliver a message no one else could hear. It is easy now to walk through these halls and see only beauty. The modern visitor leaves with photographs of ornate ceilings, delicate calligraphy, and fountains still trickling as they have for hundreds of years. But what the camera cannot capture is the weight in the air, the way the palace seems to watch you as you pass. The beauty here has always been a mask, and the longer you stand within it, the more you begin to sense the face beneath. Imagine standing alone in the imperial hall late in the day after the crowds have thinned. The afternoon light falls through tall windows, stretching shadows across the marble floor. You hear the faint tap of your own footsteps, but also something else, a sound you can't quite place, a soft brush of fabric against stone, the suggestion of a breath behind you, though no one is there. You turn, and the room is empty, but the feeling remains, clinging to your skin like the memory of heat after a fire has gone out. That is the harem's true legacy, not just the stories we know, but the presence of all we cannot prove. The women who once leaned from these windows, who once listened for the eunuch's knock at the painted cedar door, who once prayed not for love, but for survival, they are gone. But their absence fills the space like water fills a glass. The palace today is a monument, its danger gone, its power dissolved. But power leaves fingerprints that stone cannot wash away. They are in the worn grooves of the steps leading to the baths, in the indentations of wooden doors where 1,000 hands once pushed them open in fear or hope, in the faint discoloration of marble where oil lamps once stood, lighting the way to a room that could decide your life's direction in a single evening. Perhaps the most haunting thing about the harem is that it asks you to imagine what it will never show you. You will never see the night Layla, the girl from the Black Sea, was first summoned after months of preparation, her face a perfect mask hiding a heart pounding like a drum. You will never see Icy's final walk through the gardens before she vanished into the Bosphorus fog. You will never hear the conversation between two women who were meant to be rivals but shared a moment of silent understanding in the steam of the baths. These moments are gone, but they are not lost. They are stitched into the fabric of the place, waiting for someone to notice. And when you do, you realize that the harem's story is not frozen in the past. It lives in the air between these walls. This is why people come back, not just to see beauty, but to feel that quiet pull. The sense that history here is not finished speaking. The palace is no longer a cage, but it still holds its secrets, still tempts you to lean a little closer, to wonder what would happen if one of those doors, the ones firmly locked, were to open just an inch. And so we return, again and again, to these stories. We walk the same corridors, listen for the same echoes, search for the same whispers. We know we will never hear them clearly, but we keep listening, because in listening, we keep them alive. The Ottoman harem is gone, its players are gone, but the walls remain, and if you step inside and pause long enough to let the silence settle around you, you might find yourself asking the same question every woman who ever lived here must have asked, at least once, in the privacy of her thoughts. When the door closes behind me, who will remember my name? And the palace, in its patient way, will offer no answer. Only the sound of your own footsteps, and the knowledge that you are now part of the story too, if only for the time it takes to walk these halls. Did this surprise you? Stay tuned for more